Well, when we last left Russia, it was under the control of the Bolsheviks and its premier Vladimir Lenin and the head of the army Leon Trotsky. The Tsar had been gone for about 9 months. It soon became very clear that the war in Europe could not be a priority for the new Russian society. War had been draining the energy and resources of the Tsar and of the not terribly left-wing provisional government, and it wasn't doing the Bolsheviks much good either. Russia had to get out. In March of 1918, representatives of the German Empire, and now Soviet Russia, met and signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which marked the Russians' exit from the war, much to the dismay of the other allies, such as the Americans, who, once they were in it themselves, didn't like having to fight all the harder because the red pinko godless anarchists were out of it. Godless was another part of it, incidentally. Religion had to go, as the ideals and practices of the Russian Orthodox Church were in no way in keeping with the precepts of the new society. Religion, said Marx, was the opiate of the masses. Had the Bolsheviks listened to a little more beautiful Orthodox choral music, they might have had different ideas. Now that the Germans were no longer a problem, the Reds could concentrate on other things, such as their sworn enemy, the White Army. The Bolsheviks couldn't be everywhere controlling everything, and certainly didn't have universal support. The Whites were an affiliation of different groups, most of them pro-monarchy, that fought the Reds at every turn, which kept Trotsky and the Red Army very busy. So almost immediately there was civil war, resulting in widespread death and devastation. There were also invasions of Russia by forces sympathetic to the Whites, or who were at least against the Reds, including those of the US, way up in Arkhangelsk, an invasion known as the Polar Bear Expedition. Add to that the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1917 and 1918, which killed millions around the world, and a fresh outbreak of typhus. And because the people who usually supplied food and other everyday supplies were either fighting wars, being imprisoned for being anti-socialist or not socialist enough, or were dying of some horrible disease, this resulted in, you guessed it, widespread starvation. Here's a bunny. By December of 1922, after more unpleasantness than I wish to discuss here, there was finally some stability, and people were dying in a more orderly fashion. Lenin formally established the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics with its capital in Moscow. Russia was the largest of these republics, the others being places like Belarus and the Ukraine, and all those Stan countries in Central Asia, some of which had even tasted a few brief years of independence. Now the Bolsheviks could get down to, if you'll pardon the word, business. In the U.S., the brief experience in the Great War, not yet called World War I for obvious reasons, made Americans yearn for peace, a normal life, and isolation. They even refused to participate in the League of Nations, a sort of pre-United Nations, conceived by President Woodrow Wilson. Americans turned inward to jazz, baseball, movies, and playing the stock market. The president through much of the 20s was a dream come true for capitalists, Calvin Coolidge, who, it seemed, was barely there, since he was very dedicated to not interfering with business practices or Wall Street, or doing much of anything, it seemed. His successor, Herbert Hoover, a self-made millionaire in mine engineering, was friendly toward business too, but he was also very conscious of people's responsibility to society, even rich people's. He himself had quit the mining industry to help starving people in Europe during the Great War, a task which he had done splendidly. On the American system, he was heard to say later on, the problem with capitalism is capitalists. They're too damn greedy. A lot of people were indeed greedy, but a few individuals who were given a hard time in the last episode should be mentioned again. Folks like Carnegie and Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan had amassed almost inconceivable amounts of money. But that didn't mean they didn't have a strong sense of social responsibility. They made sure their families were very well taken care of course, but they also donated hundreds of millions of dollars to charitable organizations, as well as providing miscellaneous things like church organs, libraries, fine art donations, and concert halls. Carnegie Hall. Get it? And the foundations they established provided money for scholarships and universities, and later on public television, and research hospitals that helped stamp out diseases like yellow fever. Great generosity, even from the grave. Anyway, the stock market crash of 1929 did little for Herbert Hoover's reputation. Previously he had been known as the Great Problem Solver, but later he was simply the guy who couldn't stop the Great Depression. In the Soviet Union, they had been forging ahead with 5-year plans, guides for the economy and agriculture throughout Russia. These were to be followed to the letter, since they were all carefully thought out to bring the country from feudalism, mostly bypassing capitalism, and going straight to socialism, which Lenin thought to be a good idea. They were to lift the country from poverty and make its largely unskilled workers into top-of-the-line technicians and professionals, and women were to be brought into government and industry in droves. The elimination of private ownership of property and business meant that the Communist Party now pretty much had a monopoly on everything, and monopolies, as you remember, were considered excessive even in capitalist America, but here it was, for the left. Americans trusted in the free market, that supply and demand and competition would result in better and better products being developed because people would want to buy things that were made better and were reasonably priced, and even trusted that their sense of social responsibility could potentially be reflected in what they purchased. So in the end, the public would have the best of everything at its disposal. Even the casual capitalist had philosophical issues with the Soviet system. Individual achievement, and especially individual initiative, was not rewarded. Hard work only benefited society, which was a little too much, even for people who loved their own society. The Soviet 5-year plans were not always terribly comprehensible to the average worker, so it required a great deal of faith in the system. It helped that Soviet Russia had quickly become a totalitarian state, completely intolerant of dissent and free speech, with a secret police, firing squads, and a continuation of the labor camp tradition in sunny Siberia. On lighter days, there were public denunciations of suspected undesirables, and the occasional blotting out of people entirely from the public's memory. So, if workers had questions or comments about the direction socialism was taking, they would quickly be reassured that, in the future, they wouldn't have to worry too much about thinking. With the death of Lenin in 1924, a power vacuum occurred, to be filled eventually by Josef V. Stalin, who, though a dedicated Marxist theorist, was also a bloodthirsty and sadistic creature, with a very small heart. But there were a few complaints, even under Stalin. Trotsky found himself disagreeing with Comrade Stalin on a number of points, and was quickly ousted from the party and exiled from Russia, though even in Latin America he was not safe from Stalin's agents, who finally got him in 1940. Comrade Trotsky was not the only one who had cause to be worried. In the 1930s, Stalin instituted a series of purges of party members, who were usually taken care of in an unpleasant way before they could object. These purges included the by now old guard who had participated in the revolution, and there were trials where people were forced to confess crimes, whether they could have committed them or not. Their fate was usually a labor camp in Siberia, or, more easily, execution. Killed outright were people who were too conservative, too liberal, too intellectual, not intellectual enough, Jews, anyone critical of the government or suspected of being critical, and people who parted their hair on the wrong side or in the middle. The number of government-inspired deaths in the 30s alone eventually ran into the millions. However, those who survived into the 50s, when Stalin died, could take pride in knowing that they did so with the tacit blessing of the Generalissimo. And thanks to a policy of inspiring abject terror, Russians learned to love their leader with all their hearts. In the United States in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt was the new president, the fifth cousin of Theodore, though he was a progressive Democrat rather than a progressive Republican like T.R. Much to the surprise of the American people, who were suffering under a crippling economic depression, he did something government rarely did: get involved directly and actively. Roosevelt, using radio, shared with his people what the problems were and offered solutions. Then he had the Democratic Congress pass as much legislation as he could that would help people out. This was the beginning of a light kind of socialism in the U.S., the New Deal, with Social Security, the FDIC, and putting folks to work organizations like the WPA, the TVA, the PWA, the NYA, and numerous others. He got the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, not to be confused with another NRA, but only for a short time, as the Supreme Court deemed it unconstitutional. He also decided to open diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. It was a controversial move and not widely applauded. U.S. intelligence was rather limited in those days, yes, very funny, and it's doubtful that Roosevelt knew the extent to which Stalin had drifted from the goals of quietly nationalizing industries and distributing grain to all. August 23rd, 1939. Remember the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk? Well, now Stalin's people and Hitler's people met to sign a non-aggression pact. They would not go to war, though war seemed imminent. Was looming. An amazing achievement for people with two such vastly different philosophies. Perhaps it was the recognition by Hitler and Stalin that it was precisely such people who needed to establish some kind of peace plan. Or maybe it was some connection deep inside their souls. Or maybe it was just so that they could get together on their old common hobby, hating Jews. On September 1st, 1939, World War II began with the German invasion of Poland. 16 days later, in a move that just gives you a warm fuzzy, Stalin's troops invaded Poland from the east, and the two countries divided it between themselves. The pact also gave the Soviet Union a sphere of influence in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which it invaded, occupied, and held onto for about 50 years. The US still tried to be isolationist, but it was hard to ignore what was going on in Europe and East Asia. Then, on December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, where much of the US Navy was stationed, and the US declared war. Germany, an ally of Japan for some reason, declared war on the US too. On June 22, 1942, Hitler's armies, already in Poland, which was next door to Russia, attacked the Soviet Union. Hitler, it seems, had no interest in holding to the non-aggression pact. This was no surprise to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, whose predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, had been taken in by the Munich Pact, which was supposed to keep everyone happy as long as they ignored Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia. Germany and England were now supposedly good buds, though as we know, things didn't work out too well later on. Roosevelt and Churchill, who had already formed a political and personal friendship, decided to make it a trio and met with Stalin for the first time in Tehran in 1943. A careful alliance developed, with the two Westerners all too aware that Stalin was not quite one of them, especially since he was a former ally of Hitler. Nevertheless, over the next 2 years, they worked together with meetings and negotiations and plans for the war and beyond. The Germans hit the USSR hard, but resistance nevertheless continued. The Russians outlasted the Germans for 5 months at Stalingrad, and after this and a defeat in Moscow, Hitler's armies were forced into retreat, followed closely by the Soviet army, which pursued them all the way to Berlin. Eventually, 4 out of 5 German casualties in the war would take place on the Russian front. On June 6, 1944, the other Allies launched an invasion of France that was eventually to lead Britain and the US to Berlin as well. By spring of 1945, after unprecedented suffering on all sides, not to mention unspeakable war crimes, the war was finally over in Europe. The alliance, cautious as it was, had worked. But with the disappearance of the common enemy, things deteriorated very, very quickly. And on July 16, 1945, in a remote area of a hot desert, the whole world was about to change.